Hello guys, in today's video we are going to see a very interesting topic, that is the difference between interpreter and compiler. Now this is a topic which is not related to or not specific to a particular domain, but this is one of the very common as well as important topic. You can say for any exam, for any competitive exams, or this is an important topic for interviews also. In interview you can see that this is a frequently asked question. Normal programming interviews, it is a frequently asked question that what is the difference between interpreter and compiler. If we are having interpreter, then what is the use of compiler, and vice versa, that if compiler is there, what is the use of interpreter. So many people are confused in this, that what exactly the difference between these two are. So in this video we are going to discuss, I am going to show you the points, the main points that you can state that yes, these are the main differences between interpreter and compiler, and you don't need to mug up anything. I will show you step by step that all the steps, I will show you the flow, that the steps are connected with each other, and so you can clearly understand the difference. Instead of mugging up, we will try to understand the difference, that how these both are working and what are the difference between them. Okay, so let's start. This side I will be writing for interpreter and this side I will be writing the points for compiler. Okay, so first difference that we can consider between interpreter and compiler is that interpreter executes single line of code at a time. Okay, whereas our compiler takes the entire program at a time. So the main difference is, in interpreter you can say that it takes single line of code or instruction. I am writing also for you so that at the end you can either take a snapshot or you can note down the points, so that in future you can refer from there. Instruction, sorry. It takes single line of code or instruction at a time. Fine. Whereas compiler, what it does is, it takes entire program at a time. This is the basic difference between them. Once you understand this thing, all the points will be coming from this point itself. This is the main and the first point and the main point, that in interpreter we are taking, in interpreter it takes single line of code or instruction at a time, whereas the compiler takes the whole program or whole code at a time and executes it. Fine. And this is the main difference. Now as I told you, this is the main difference. So based on that, what we can say, that it requires less time. It takes the entire program at a time. Sorry, interpreter is comparatively slower, right? Because logically also you can say it takes single line of code or instruction at a time, so obviously it is slower. Right, this is nothing that we have to by heart anything. And compiler takes whole program. Obviously if you are taking something line by line, and in this case you are taking it all at a once, then it is obvious that it is faster. It is faster as compared to interpreter, right? Interpreter is comparatively slower, whereas compiler is comparatively faster. So these are the points that are related. Then in third point you can say that interpreter does not produce any intermediate object code. Okay, whereas compiler does generate intermediate object code. Let me write it down here for you. Interpreter does not, let me underline it, it does not produce any intermediate object code, whereas compiler produces intermediate object code, right? This is the main, one of the main differences again, that interpreter does not produce any intermediate object code, it directly converts it, whereas compiler does produce intermediate object code. Fine. Now again, as these 2 points were related, that it takes single line of code, so you can say that it is slower. So in this case, what we can deduct from it, that obviously it produces intermediate object code, right? and that is why it produces intermediate object code. Now obviously if it produces, then we do need something or some place to store it. So in this case what happens, that memory requirement increases. Memory requirement in case of compiler is more. You understood why I am giving you the reason, that it produces intermediate object code. So obviously we need some space to store that intermediate object code. So due to this, the memory requirement increases in case of compiler, whereas in case of interpreter there is no intermediate object code, and so memory requirement is comparatively less. Right, we can directly deduct it from the previous point. Memory requirement is less in this case. Then the next difference is, in interpreter, what happens is that the compilation and execution takes place simultaneously, whereas in case of compiler, it does the whole compilation at once, and after the completion of compilation, then and only then it does the execution. So if I write that point, interpreter, what happens in this, that compilation and execution take place simultaneously. I would wish that with me you also note it down somewhere. So we'll note it down together so that it will be easier for you to understand and take the points however we are discussing it. Whereas in compiler, the compilation is done before execution. The compilation is done first and then execution takes place. Right, this is the main difference between these two. Okay, fine. Compilation and execution takes place simultaneously. In case of interpreter, simultaneously means both will work end in end. They will work together. Compilation will also go on and execution will also go on. Whereas in case of compiler, compilation is done first and then execution takes place. Now, as you can see here, compilation and execution takes place simultaneously in interpreter. And we have already seen that it takes single line of code, means line by line it is done. So, how the flow is, understand here. If I am having 5 lines of code, first of all, interpreter will take the first line. It will compile it, it will execute it, and then it takes a single line, right? So, first of all, it will take the line number 1. It will compile it and execute it, and at the same time, it will show if any error exists in that first line. Understood? But what happens in case of compiler? Compiler takes the entire program at a time. It compiles the whole program at a time, then it executes the whole program at a time, and so what happens, that it displays all the errors at the same time after this process completes. I hope you got the difference, right? So we have seen, see, this point and the point I am going to write, they are interrelated, that it takes the single line, and so it will take the single line, it will compile and execute it, and so what happens, it displays error of each line one by one. You got the reason, right? But in case of compiler, what will happen, that it will display all the error, display all errors at the same time after compilation. Now the last point, actually there can be many differences if you sit and note down all, but as I told, in case of any exam or in case of any interviews or just for your general knowledge also, if you know 6 to 8 points, it is more than enough. You should know these basic differences between these two. Okay, so let us see the last point here, that if we say the point of view from error detection, then it is quite difficult in case of compiler. Error detection is quite difficult in case of compiler. let me write it down here. Error detection is difficult, but in case of interpreter, error detection is easier compared to compiler. So what is the reason here? Reason would be same, that in case of interpreter we are taking single line, we are compiling it, we are executing it, and so single line only we are looking for errors, and so error detection is easier, that we will be looking for a single line. If there is an error, okay. If there is no error, then also okay. But in case of compiler, we are taking the whole code at a time. So obviously when we are scanning the whole code at a time for the error, looking for the error, so obviously error detection is difficult in that case. So these are the main 7 points. If you remember these 7 points, if you understand these 7 points, then you will be clear about what the actual differences between the interpreter and compiler. I hope you have understood it. Thank you so much.